One might wonder why 8 to 10 million Asians in the world makes it necessary for Hollywood to have white actors playing roles of Orientals in their films. Today on the Roundtable Perspective, Dr. Karla Fuller from Columbia College joins me in examining representations constructed in Hollywood that have changed but have adjusted but remain much the same in representations of Asians. Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Lee Artz. I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. Karla Fuller from Columbia College. We're going to discuss Oriental representation in Hollywood. Dr. Fuller got her Ph.D. from Northwestern, and I see that you got your bachelor's from Amherst College.
Yes, yes indeed.
And I also want to talk to you about Hollywood Goes Oriental, but the first thing that struck me is you're from Amherst College, and we're going to discuss representations of race and representations and how they become normalized, particularly in the media. But Amherst interests me in particular because Amherst was an early colonialist, and I understand he's famous for having given blankets with smallpox to the Indians. A gesture of goodwill devastated the population. But it's still called Amherst.
Yes, Lord Jeffrey Amherst. We have a song, we had a little inn named after him, and our mascot was named after him. Literally, I guess last year is when it happened, but there's been a lot of rumblings in recent years about changing the name precisely because of that. Awful, horrific history. So they have changed the name of our mascot to the Mammoths, okay, which I, have mixed feelings about. But I'm glad it's not, Lord Jeff anymore. There's also a hotel that's part of our campus, the Lord Jeff Inn. It's been changed to Boltwood Inn, which is the street that it's on. So we're making changes, and I think most of the people want that.
Well, it's not really disconnected, but from what we want to talk about, your work, Hollywood Goes Oriental, and how we begin to understand with not often knowing the background for it. So we're happy to be Lord Jeffs, not knowing that Lord Jeff was committed genocide against the Indians. It just seems normal and natural, and that would be your work on representation of race suggests that that's true in much of the entertainment. We have these images, we have these representations, and then they become what we accept as viewers of movies.
Well, it's very important, and I think it's very different when you have a representation of a particular group, minority group in particular. But I just want to, people ask me, like, how did I get to this subject matter of non-Asian actors playing Asian roles? And it's kind of a very interesting journey. Basically, I discovered cinema, my interest in cinema, when I was an undergraduate, so I always encourage my undergraduates to explore because I didn't know what was coming. I took a course in Japanese, post-war Japanese cinema, and I was just sort of blown away by the films and by the acting and the performers and the depth of the storytelling. And I wondered years later, because it changed everything for me, why I might have been so impressed by the Japanese films. And I came to the conclusion that it was because I had grown up with images, caricatured images of Asian actors. And Asian actors played by Caucasians mostly. That was sort of my idea of what an Asian was and why the Japanese films were such a revelation to me.
Was it a revelation because they were Japanese actors, not white Americans playing Japanese, or was it a revelation because they were no longer caricatures of being Japanese?
Both.
Okay.
Both. I think the first impact had to do with all Japanese actors, authentically Japanese actors. as opposed to white actors. So I grew up in the era where the leading roles were not given to Asian actors. And so that was basically my world because I didn't grow up.
Well, the white actors would be asked to play Asian roles according to the expectation of what an Asian character would, act like or look like. And,
exactly.
And then the makeup and the dress. I mean, how exactly were the depictions such that a viewing audience would say, oh, that's a Japanese actor, that's a Chinese actor? I mean, where do we get that from, I guess? And then how do the actors that play those roles slide into those representations?
Well, I think it's really complex. You have established white stars who are cast to play leading roles in every type of story. We're talking the 1930s through the 1960s, and then it all kind of changes. So they had particular makeup artists to create an otherworldly look. Not exactly Asian, but not exactly Caucasian either. The directors, Frank Capra, who directed It's a Wonderful Life, also directed a key film in the book called The Bitter Tea of General Yen, where he had a Swedish actor, make up. He said, well, he wasn't Asian, but he definitely wasn't white anymore, but we had created something different. So it was acceptable to be different and not necessarily have some sort of fidelity to a group.
Well, it was fiction. I mean, they're creating
Absolutely.
a fiction. I mean, their defense is usually, well,
Right.
it's just a story.
Right,
So,
exactly. But the complexity really has to do with them wanting some sort of authenticity. So you would find a white actor in the white actors in the leading roles, and sometimes in the major supporting roles, but always the background. And sometimes the supporting roles were by Asian actors, actual Asian actors. So there was this hierarchy created where they wanted the actual Asian actors, but only in the background, sort of contained
give it
and
some
controlled.
authenticity, I guess.
Exactly, exactly. But basically, their stories and their experience, they were not allowed to use their bodies. They were not allowed to use theirs. And whites were, mostly whites, but in my book, there's not just whites.
So your book, I should say, is Hollywood Goes Oriental, Caucasian Performance in American Film.
Right.
And I have several questions, but one that jumps out at me is the use of the word Oriental. Edward Said and others have challenged the use of that and suggest that there's some racist connotations with it. So, but you chose that, I would say, deliberately, unless the publisher did it. You chose it, and so why Oriental? Why not Asian or?
Because I think Hollywood's creations were fictional, just like Oriental is a fictional label.
So they weren't going Asian.
No,
they were going.
They were not. They were going for this fictional Orient that never really, that keeps moving, it keeps shifting, and it's in the Western imagination. It's not Asian.
So it is what Said and others have said.
Absolutely.
You're just suggesting that Hollywood decided to go here with the full understanding that they're not Asian American, but they have this appearance of being
And that
Asian.
was primary. That was their primary goal, to create an Oriental, to create an Orient on film.
So what would some of these be? I mean, what would some of the depictions? So you've got a white actor, you've put makeup on, there's got to be some colorization to it, but what else? Were there others? Were there other language inflections? Was there body posture? Were there, I mean, what were some of the things that would convince an audience that this is?
This is very interesting that you talk sort of the performance, because in the book I sort of break apart like what the Oriental performance is. And I have a chapter on the Oriental detective. And I say Oriental detective purposely because the characters of Charlie Chan
is the one
Mr. Moto, and Mr. Wong, which a lot of people don't know that Boris Karloff played. So a lot of these actors, when they became, when they were older and played other roles, Katharine Hepburn never talked about playing an Asian in Dragon Seed, a wartime picture that portrayed the Chinese as very positively and the Japanese as terrible. But anyway, I digress. In terms of the performance, there was great attention to the makeup, as I said before. They focused on the eyes, and they focused on the hair. But in the case of like a Charlie Chan or a detective, there was also this sense of way of speaking.
Yes.
So there was this sort of fractured English, definitely English, but fractured, and what the producers of the movies always said poetic. But a lot of Asians thought it was very caricatured and not realistic at all. In Charlie Chan, the father was played by Warner Oland, Sidney Toler, and Roland Winters. Three, very popular. Obviously, it's part of our culture. There's even an anthology.
And none of those are Asian actors.
No,
those
they are
all,
not.
But their whole persona was created to be this Oriental look, which
That's
was
right.
the skin.
That's
and
right.
the eyes, and I think even the dress, maybe the
absolutely.
the clothing that they would
Yes,
wear. Yes,
absolutely. And I think that the reason why I say these Oriental performances are complex is because within all these narratives, there's another depiction going on. Like with Charlie Chan, he would have the fractured English, but his son would not, and he'd be played by an Asian. And we accepted all this because it's fiction,
yes.
for sure.
Yes.
It's fiction for sure. But yet there was limited exposure to members of that group. If there was limited exposure, like in my case, that would be your total sense of that group.
Yeah, that's all you would know. I mean,
all you would know.
Unless you lived in California or
Right.
something, you might have some interaction.
That's
but
right.
was that for a narrative reason to have Charlie Chan be the traditional or the authentic Chinese, whereas his son would be an Americanized, and
That's
you're
right.
making this point so that Charlie Chan can do his detective role because of his Oriental character, so to speak? I mean, is that part of the
Yes.
narrative required that you
Absolutely.
have these?
Part of the narrative. However, there's an effect that happens with that narrative, which exists in the books that the movies were based on. There is a sense that Charlie Chan's character, in his fractured English and his deference and his, humility, is preferable to his son's brashness, which is dramatized as something often comical.
Yes.
And
and wrong. Again,
absolutely.
in the narrative, the son may seem to be slightly more American, but he has not kept the tradition of the proper role for the Chinese detective, which is respect and patience.
Right.
And, so that depiction also goes a long ways towards assimilation. I mean, is this a suggestion of what's the best way to assimilate?
Well, I think, the assimilation would be fine if it was sort of normalized, but it's often comical and ridiculed. The fact that a son would use American slang is actually humorous to the audience. It's not like, oh, well, of course he's Americanized, he's assimilated. That would be expected. But it's ridiculed. It's seen as unnatural to who the character is. So these Oriental depictions where the actors are made up and they're walking very slowly and very stiffly, who knows who came up with that, are also compared to the Asian performances, the supporting Asian performances or the background performances that give it some authenticity. I just wanted to mention Dragon Seed, which a lot of people haven't heard of, but a lot of people have heard of Pearl S. Buck. And she wrote Dragon Seed, and I was thinking about the production of that film and how you think, well, it's only fiction, so we can put on whatever we want. we still want to look at that because,
well, yeah,
ideology.
because then you can make anything fiction. The question is, why did you choose
why did
to
you
do
choose
that
certain things?
particular representation?
In Dragon Seed, they had a Chinese consultant to look at the script, and I was lucky enough to go to Los Angeles and be able to go to the library and see the production files. He looked at the script, and he wrote many memos to the production team saying that the speech was awkward and really criticizing the focus, the unnatural or the Oriental focus of the film. And none of his suggestions were heeded.
What year was this?
1944.
So this would be still, the war is still going
Absolutely.
on, so there must be some political motivation, not necessarily direct government intervention, but certainly Hollywood producers were.
But the Chinese were our friends.
Right, caught up in
point.
that, so the Chinese would be depicted in a very favorable light.
Right,
yes.
But still he was saying this is not natural speech.
Yeah,
this is he lays it out there. And of course they put him on to ask for authenticity for their fictional work.
Yes.
So it's a slippery slope.
So he still appears as a consultant.
He certainly does.
We don't necessarily heed his advice. So.
No.
So was there distinct, gestures or postures or language between men and women? Because you said this was Katharine Hepburn. Was there something different than the male leads and the female leads? I mean, oftentimes we hear roles of women being, Mata Hari or right, or the housewife or the noodle maker, but I'm not sure if there was certain stereotypical roles that.
Well, I think in a lot of the films, you had what you had in opera, like Madame Butterfly, or in literature, the very subservient Asian woman. And, or if she wasn't subservient or deferential enough, she was pure evil. Yeah. She was, conniving behind the scenes to do something awful, could not be trusted, mysterious. Yeah, and that goes for both genders, but this idea of being mysterious.
There's a certain level of distrust with the mysterious, right?
Absolutely.
Even though Charlie might be able to solve the problem, there's a level that you can't completely bring him in, so. And
I would say the performance is not just makeup and costuming and hair, it's also the way the actors are shot. So you have a so-called positive character, like Charlie Chan, the Oriental detective, is the hero, he's the leading person, and he's played by a white actor. But he's often shot in darkness and in very sort of mysterious, there's no other word for it, mysterious surroundings. Of course, he's trying to solve a mystery, but oftentimes there's a dark side even to this positive in terms of visuals in the film.
And because it's a film, we aren't necessarily making critical judgments or going down a checklist. It has this visceral effect on it, particularly if it's repeated.
Right.
You almost expect that this is what, and if somebody doesn't play that particular role, it may seem at odds with what you're there to.
Well, I think
I'm saying that because at a certain point, if Hollywood's doing this and they're successful, someone coming along like the consultant saying, well, this isn't natural language, but you're reluctant to do that because you've been so successful in the stereotypes or the representations you've been using.
People don't want to see an actual Asian with dimension and, not caricatured, not made so different and somewhat comical and somewhat weird. They want to see that. That's what they want to see. Why would we not do that? But they have the consultant, a nod to an Asian, that we have gotten their approval for this.
There's an interesting flip here that you talk about in the book. You mentioned a little bit, but there's a flip because during World War II, the Chinese are good, the Japanese are evil, but we're in the 21st century and that's been flipped so that the Japanese are good and the Chinese are evil. But when you're talking about this mysterious nature of all Orientals and the darkness and the thing, it's not as difficult to flip because it's not a complete flip, it's more of an adjustment, is that? I really tried to get that across in the book. That's exactly right. It's not a flip,
it's an adjustment. It's always there, but it's sometimes it recedes in the background, and sometimes it's foregrounded. But I would say in all these depictions, whether they're allies or enemies, it's a really good point about the Chinese being our friends during World War II and then not being our friends after the war, and the Japanese being an occupied.
And I realize that's all at a
Right.
U.S.-based perspective.
Oh, of course. And we
Because we're talking about Hollywood movies. So,
right.
yeah.
Occupied Japan, but it was based on, sort of geopolitical movements. You have Tea House of the August Moon. You have Breakfast at Tiffany's. You have Japanese characters that are held up to ridicule. So we still don't get dimensional characters. We still get an Oriental or yellow face, which is mostly used for humor, roles after the war for our allies, our new allies.
Would it be possible for someone that was not Chinese to play a Chinese role in a positive way? I mean, if they, or is there something that is inherently problematic about non-Chinese playing Chinese or non-Indian playing Indians, or is it possible for characters to be true to whatever the story is or the depiction?
Well, I think that it's, Hollywood is the dream factory of the world. It's huge, and they have a lot of talent to pull from. And I don't think people want, every role. If you're Indonesian, you have to be Indonesian, or if you have to be Filipino, we got to get a Filipino. But I think actually that can happen because there is a range of people.
I just wonder. I mean, I think of The Last Samurai. That the
Yes.
Last Samurai was, but I'm not sure. But it seemed like there was an attempt to treat it culturally positive. Or the Kevin Costner film where he was a Native American.
Yes.
The Native American.
Right.
Again, the question would be, why choose that actor? There's plenty of Chinese actors. There are plenty of Native actors. But the other question is that would be addressed is, well, yeah, but it's Kevin Costner. He's going to attract people as long as he's not giving us stereotypical or offensive depictions. Why would this? Is it inherently bad or just problematic? I guess.
Well, I think if it was just a matter of casting and then presenting a dimensional character, that might be problematic with some, less problematic for others. But the two films that you mentioned, you actually have white actors playing white roles and interacting with these groups, yes. And sort of the white savior syndrome.
Yes.
That they
so
save
although he
the
was
natives.
Asian, but he's the white guy that's an Asian, and same way with Costner.
Yeah.
We don't have a lot of time left, just a few minutes, but I want to move forward because I'd like to get your thoughts on Crazy Rich Asians, because it's often presented as here's positive depictions of Asians, but I have some questions. But I first wanted to know it's an all Asian cast?
Yes.
So
I rushed out to see it because I was so excited that there was this all Asian cast, and guess what? There were no big stars except Michelle Yeoh, who's been in a ton of movies. So they can have a strong concept and not have a white leading person or a white person leading it. So I was very excited about it. And I enjoyed most of it. It's a beautiful movie. It's a fantasy. Yeah. It's a fantasy. There was really no attempt to depict something real, except, that, some Asians do have a lot of money, and it's fun to see that. I know people who had a problem with it because there are so few all Asian.
And this is the one we get.
This is the one we get.
It struck me when you talk about dimensional,
and there's
because
so
I'm not
much
sure
pressure. There's so much pressure, but I took it as a fantasy. But of course, I don't want to dismiss, because even fantasy can be problematic.
It's what you said before. It's fiction, but why did you choose this fiction?
Right.
So if you're going to choose to have dimensional characters, to kind of correct, I mean, one film can't.
Right.
To try to make some addition to the conversation of 40 or 50 years of Hollywood Orientalism, and this is the one that you pick.
Right. I still see it as a step forward. I see it as a step forward because it did extremely well commercially, and they'll be making more films with Asian actors, and then they can dimensionalize, if that's a word,
Well,
the
perhaps,
characters.
but once we get into a certain model, the media tends to reproduce something. So it will be interesting to see Crazy Rich Asians 2 or something. Or maybe it will be Crazy Not So Rich Asians.
Possibly,
Which may be more representative. Well, thank you, Dr. Karla Fuller,
You're welcome.
for being here today. The time goes fast. Maybe we can talk to you again, but that's all the time we have on our program today. Thanks, Dr. Fuller, for joining me on the Roundtable Perspective. I'm Lee Artz. See you next time.